Thanks. Yeah, hard to follow Len because that was so detailed and fantastic. So mine's not very long either, so in the short time I have today, I really just want to say a few words about Leonard's 2018 essay that a lot of us have been talking about on necro being an actuarial account of racism, and then just suggest a few points of convergence between Harris's work and Deleuze's. 6 sections in the paper, so they go very quickly, but I'll tell you them just so you can follow along. So, Section 1, Harris's actuarial analysis of necro-being. Harris's notion of necro-being seems to have come, in part at least, from Achille Mbembe's 1992 article, Necropolitics, and refers to a state in which people, though physically alive, are forced into a kind of living death. For Harris, racism is, quote, a polymorphous agent of death that utilizes an array of means to stigmatize and dehumanize a population, resulting in premature births, shortened lives, this is a list from Leonard, starving children, debilitating theft, abusive larceny, degrading insults, insulting stereotypes, cruel punishments, crippling confinement. Mbembe notes that while the Nazi death camps may have been the place in which the most absolute inhumane condition ever to appear on earth was realized, the singularity of the Holocaust does not lessen the fact that a living death is an everyday reality for many of those subject to necropolitics. What is new in Harris's work is that he brings an actuarial approach to the analysis of necro-being. An actuarial analysis, which is used today most obviously by insurance companies, is a statistical method that analyzes data to make predictions and to quantify risk. Males aged 18 to 24 are charged more for car insurance, for instance, because statistical analysis shows they are involved in more accidents than older males or than women of the same age. Harris has adopted this approach because he is critical of more traditional explanations of racism, such as volitional accounts, which attribute racism to individual intentions and beliefs, and institutional accounts, which focus on systemic structures and policies that perpetuate racial disparities. An actuarial approach, Harris argues, can better assess the pervasive and lethal effects of racism by focusing on the real consequences of racism through tangible metrics like life expectancy, death rates, the prevalence of disease, the cost of healthcare, and incarceration statistics. Since racism is not a singular monolithic phenomenon, but rather comprises a multiplicity of forms, an actuarial approach provides a method for analyzing the concrete ways in which racism manifests itself differently in various contexts and how it depends on a variety of historical, social, and cultural factors, thereby opening up more effective and nuanced strategies to address it. Necro-being, like all of Harris's writings, is a remarkable text, and I find his arguments for an actuarial approach entirely persuasive. Yet Harris himself admits that there is an ambiguity in his appeal to actuarial analyses. One reason for this is that in the 1700s, as he points out, the entire slave trade was the province of actuaries who, and I quote, calculated based on the probability of death how much should be paid for a slave, how many slaves should be placed in the hold of slave ships, how many could be expected to die while still turning a profit, and so on. And now Harris is proposing that we use the very same actuarial analyses that propelled the slave trade itself to help reveal the concrete consequences of racism today, though the questions it addresses now have changed. And again, I quote, how long a given sort of person lives today, what illnesses they are subject to, the costs associated with medical care for those illnesses, and so on. So in effect, Harris is taking the kind of actuarial analysis that fostered and supported racism in the slave trade and trying to turn it now against racism. It is a brilliant, I think, and provocative move, and it is the jumping off point for the 4 comments I would like to make on the relation between Harris and Deleuze. So second section, technologies of the state, statistics and big data. First, actuarial analyses are, of course, a form of statistical analysis, and statistics, as the very name indicates, was originally proposed to be a science of the state, statistics, that's where the name comes from. The term was coined by a German political scientist named Gottfried Aschenwald in the 1740s, who saw statistics as a science, and even more specifically as a technology, that would provide a state with a knowledge of the biological status of its population, its size, its birth and death rates, the distributions of diseases, and so on. Michel Foucault called it a form of biopower. Like the panopticon of disciplinary power, statistics at once allowed the state to see its population more clearly and thereby to control it more completely. In the 19th century, statistics expanded beyond state-related information and became a field of its own, a discipline of its own. Students in many disciplines now, including at Purdue, are forced to take classes in statistics, and in the past decade, statistics has now become merged with data science. In late 2015, Stanford's Department of Statistics officially changed its name to the Department of Statistics and Data Science. Needless to say, then, the status of data has changed drastically. In 1977, Michel Foucault had considered publishing an anthology of texts called The Lives of Infamous Men, or I think better translated as The Lives of Minuscule Humans. He never did carry out the project, which would have chronicled the data of ordinary people who had disappeared from history completely, except for a brief entry entered into the bureaucratic archive of a prison, an asylum, or a hospital. So here's the entry for a man named Jean-Antoine Touzard, who entered the Bicêtre Asylum in Paris on April 12, 1701. Quote, seditious apostate friar, capable of the greatest crimes, sodomite, atheist, if that were possible. This individual is a veritable monster of abomination, whom it would be better to stifle than to leave at large. End of quote. These lines are literally all the data that remains of the life of the unfortunate Monsieur Touzard, and they exist only because at one point in his life, Monsieur Touzard's life intersected with a state institution that recorded this data. And indeed, such fleeting archival records already step above the fate of most human beings most of the time, which is the degree zero in which people die without leaving behind the slightest trace of their existence, absolutely no data whatsoever. All of us in this room, of course, live in a completely different regime now, where the amount of data and information that is preserved about each of us has grown exponentially. In his book, How We Became Our Data, Colin Koopman has traced the history of our insertion into this ever-expanding network of informatics, moving from birth and death certificates that bookend our lives to the credit cards, driver's licenses, passports, and social security numbers that indeed we often now carry with us. And now, with the arrival of big data, we have entered into what Shoshana Zuboff has called, in a well-known book you probably know, the age of surveillance capitalism. Smartphones gather data on all of us to a degree that Stalin's Secret Service could have only dreamed of. The danger now is to be undocumented, to be, as the French say, sans papier, without papers, without data. The danger is to be disconnected from the grid of data, to have one's visa denied, to have one's credit card suspended, and so on. But statistics and data science, in short, are technologies of the state, technologies by which we are formatted by the state. So, third section now, then Deleuze and Guattari's theory of the state. This brings me to my second point, which is the first line of convergence between Harris and Deleuze's work. I remember even as a young person being puzzled by the existence of kings, which often appeared, in the fairy tales we're given as kids. How did it come about that one person, the king, or the emperor, the pharaoh, the czar, whatever, got to be in charge of everyone else? How exactly did one get that job, I wonder? Donald Trump clearly has asked the same question himself, I think. But I'm quite serious. I always wondered this as a kid. So this is why I think Deleuze's analysis of the state as an apparatus of capture gives a bit of an answer. In Deleuze's analysis, the archaic state was an apparatus of capture that incorporated land, human activity, and exchange into its form of interiority through three abstractions: rent, labor, and money, which are a variant of the Trinity formula analyzed by Marx in the third book of Das Kapital. That's chapter 48, worth reading. But to summarize quickly, 1, rent is a mechanism of capture that incorporates the earth into the state apparatus through the invention of geometry, and metrics of the earth. Geometry was an abstract and striated space that was imposed upon the earth, and that not only allowed the earth to be divided and portioned out in plots, but allowed the yields of the plots to be compared differentially so as to extract the appropriate rent for the state and therefore for the despot. Similarly, second, labor is a mechanism of capture that incorporates human activity into the state. Strictly speaking, labor and surplus labor are exactly the same thing. Surplus labor simply being that portion of human activity that the state demands of its subjects, like rent, and winds up stockpiling in monumental public works projects like pyramids, great walls, or irrigation projects, which is really stockpiled human labor. So the Egyptian pyramids, for instance, were not constructed by slaves, but by conscripted Egyptian labor. And then finally, thirdly, money is a mechanism of capture that was introduced by the state not to serve the needs of commerce, but to make taxation possible. Money is an abstract equivalent for everything and anything, and once it was introduced into exchange, the state could insert its grubby paws into every transaction and appropriate a portion of it for the state. So rent, labor, money are the three fundamental aspects of the state's apparatus of capture. Rent captures the earth, labor captures human activity, and money captures exchange. Each of these mechanisms is an abstraction, just as the state itself is an abstraction, and they each converge on the person of the despot or the king, who is at once the eminent landowner, the entrepreneur of large-scale projects, and the master of taxes and prices. So hence the answer to my youthful question, the king is just a space, not really the person, the line of convergence of all these mechanisms of capture. This is why Lewis Mumford could describe the archaic state literally as a mega machine, the largest machine ever constructed by humanity, a kind of pyramid in which human beings at its base function as its working parts in a kind of generalized enslavement, with the despot or the king at its apex and a vast bureaucracy in between to make the machine function. In our fourth section, the technology of writing. So this then brings me to a third point, since there was one technology in particular that above all made these three mechanisms of the state function and function well, and that was the technology of writing. James C. Scott notes that the earliest administrative tablets found in Mesopotamia are comprised primarily of three things: lists, lists, and lists. Mostly of grain, manpower, and taxes. In other words, these three apparatuses of capture. Writing has always been tied to state administration, since every state needs a system of notation to make its labor power and production legible to it. But here we find an ambiguity with regard to writing that is similar to the ambiguity Harris finds in actuarial analyses. Claude Lévi-Strauss, the great French anthropologist, in his classic book Triste Tropique, put forward the hypothesis that, quote, the primary function of writing is to facilitate the enslavement of other human beings. And he continued, the use of writing for disinterested ends, with a view to satisfactions of the mind in the fields either of science or the arts, is a secondary result of its invention, and may even be no more than a way of reinforcing, justifying, or dissimulating its primary function of enslaving. This latter claim stings somewhat. Lévi-Strauss himself was extraordinarily literate and an extraordinary writer. All of us here in this room are highly literate, and many of us work for an institution, the university, that is the guardian of literacy. The push toward universal literacy took off in the 19th century, to the point where today the very word literacy has practically become synonymous with being civilized. Anyone who is not literate is uncivilized, uneducated, uncultured. We do not reflect enough on the fact that most of us were forced to spend a good part of our early lives, probably 12 to 15 years of our lives, mastering the technology of writing and reading. That's what education is about: reading, writing, arithmetic. Because becoming literate is a way of internalizing the fundamental technologies of the state in a kind of voluntary servitude. Forcing people to become literate was a way of giving them the means to fulfill their duties to the state: voting, filing tax returns, applying for work, signing leases and contracts, following printed instruction, passing written driver's exam, balancing a checkbook, understanding our employee benefit, and above all, understanding the laws of the state. We have all, in short, become internalized scribes. I certainly do not mean to deny the many benefits of literacy. As Len just pointed out, it's my own métier, it's our métier of all of us. It's what philosophers generally do. We write books and we write articles. But as Sophocles said, nothing vast enters the life of mortals without a curse. In agrarian societies, literacy was not seen as a necessary skill, and James C. Scott notes that in Mesopotamia, writing was resisted because of its indelible association with the state and with taxes, just as plowing was long resisted because of its indelible association with drudgery. Even the Bible says, this in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, that it was Satan himself who incited King David to take a census of Israel. which implies writing and getting control of the population. In short, statistics, data science, and even writing, these are all technologies of the state. And I would just add in passing that artificial intelligence, with its ability to process vast amounts of data in order to recognize patterns and make predictions, should likewise be placed in the technological lineage of such technologies of the state. So number 5 now. My 5th and final point, and then I'll conclude, so it's not very long. The 4th and final point of connection I would like to make very briefly concerns the relation of reason to the technology of the state, in particular to the role that writing itself played in the constitution of what we take to be rationality. Siegfried Gideon, the historian of architecture, once wrote, quote, "Any technology makes explicit what was implicit and automatic in the process it replaces." And David Olson, in a fantastic book called The Mind on Paper, so the mind in writing, has persuasively argued that it was the technology of writing that made explicit the structure of language. We tend to think of language as made up of sentences. Sentences are made up of words. Words are made up of letters. But of course, there were no letters until the invention of the technique of the alphabet. And in that sense, no words or sentences, at least as we understand them now with the invention of writing. Indeed, more generally, what the technologization of language ultimately brought about was a decontextualization of language that established a domain of what we might call autonomous discourse, in which propositions and language exist as an independent reality that is separated from both the world and from the speakers of any given language. In other words, language becomes this autonomous thing, just kind of hovering out there. Philosophers, for instance, are concerned with the question of truth, which asks how sentences denote or correspond to the world. It's a theory of reference, of course. But they rarely ask the question of how propositions were separated from the world in the first place, such that the question of how to reconnect them to the world became an essential philosophical problem. Similarly, the notion of belief entails the relation of a person or a subject to an independent proposition that is separate from them, in which they can either affirm or deny. But there too, the question of how these propositions got separated from the speaking subject is rarely asked. And logic, of course, deals with the relations of such autonomous propositions among themselves. Even Socrates' famous "what is" question, what is beauty, what is courage, what is justice, assumes that one can assess words separated from their object. In short, and this is the main point I want to make here, one could say that it was the technologization of language by phonetic writing as a technology of the state that made possible, at least in part, the domain that philosophy now recognizes at its own, namely rationality, which rests on the constitution of language as an autonomous and independent entity. I don't know if any of you know David Kahneman's work, his book Thinking Fast and Slow. He's an economist, won the Nobel Prize. This is everything he calls system 2, or slow thinking, as opposed to intuitive, fast thinking. So last section now, conclusion, and then I'll be done. To conclude, Harris proposes an actuarial account of racism. But as we noted at the start, Harris readily admits that an actuarial approach can help critique racism for the same reason that it earlier helped to support racism and foster the slave trade. It is a statistical method that can not only make visible the necro-being produced by racist practices, such as shortened lifespans or higher cost of medical care, but it can also determine the numbers of slaves that one can let die on a transatlantic voyage while still turning a profit. The same methods, the same actuarial approach produce both results. And the point of my reflections, which were totally prompted by Harris's work, has been to suggest that the same ambiguity lies at the heart of every technology of the state, not only actuarial analyses, but also statistics, data science, geometry, money, and perhaps above all, as I suggested, writing. If Levi-Strauss noted that writing was invented to facilitate the enslavement of human beings, and there is Levi-Strauss noted that writing was invented to facilitate the enslavement of human beings, and there's a sense that in promoting universal literacy, states deliberately aim to have their subject appropriate and eternalize that enslavement, even if writing at the same time became the condition of philosophy, logic, truth, and everything we associate with rational thought. Melvin Kronzberg, if you do any work in the philosophy of technology, which I've been teaching recently, you know this line. He famously formulated a law about technology that says, technology is neither good nor bad. neither is it neutral, which is a good, because we don't know in advance whether it's good or bad, but it's never neutral, no matter what you think. Far from being a drawback of Harris's approach to racism, it brings Harris close to Deleuze's concept of a diagram, which is a shifting map of power relations that determines how technologies function at any given moment. It's related also to the two uses of the syntheses that someone mentioned yesterday from Anti-Oedipus. The actuarial model that once calculated how many slaves could die in a ship is the same model that today calculates racial disparities in health outcomes. Similarly, geometric models that were once used for segregationist urban planning have also been used for community-led countermapping projects. The predictive policing algorithms that reinforce racial bias are the same methods used to expose racist policing through statistical audits. Every state technology, in other words, is a diagram of power that can be reinscribed, repurposed, or subverted. And the great strength of Harris's work, particularly with regard to actuarial analysis, is to have shown the possibility and power of the tactical deterritorialization and reterritorialization of all these state technologies. Thanks. That's it.
If I could be first.
Yes, you may.
So, fantastic talk. It's always a joy to hear you speak, Dan. So I have two questions for you. I think maybe one a little bit easier, the other one perhaps a little bit more expansive. The first one is, I think in your section 3, you made a distinction between, or you said that the king occupied a space, and I was wondering if you could make the distinction between that space and, I mean, often I hear about kings or these kinds of things in terms of functions or roles, so wondering your thoughts on that. And the second question I have is, are then philosophers, or because of how we're trained in the art of writing and speaking and whatnot, because of our formation now, are philosophers only possible within a state apparatus? And the connected question to that is, otherwise in something like pre-state or primitive society, something like that, otherwise is the function of the philosopher something more like a magician or a shaman? And here I have in the background thinking about a Taoism, as I recognize Taoism. It's in opposition to Confucianism, and oftentimes when I'm reading the Tao and doing some research on that, there's a very big respect toward nature, and it seems to function closer to shamanism than to what we might associate with more state mechanisms in Confucianism.
Yeah, good. Second one's a hard question, so let me start with the first one. So, yeah, it's a space, and really this sort of just the insight of structuralism, right? That there's a structure there, and like the chessboard, and the space is determined by a structure. And I think Deleuze is not a structuralist strictly in that sense, but I think that's the basic point about the role of the king, that it's a space that is there in the mechanism of capture, which is where all these lines of capture converge and resonate. So he is just the eminent landover. He owns everything. You know, it's just a function that is played by not even the person of the king, but the structure of the state. This kind of pyramid where something has to be at the apex in which all these things converge and resonate. That's at least his analysis of the apparatus of capture. But he says this kind of milieu of interiority. You know, like it just wants to take everything and make it internal, which he also says becomes a model of thinking. Because we think to think is to take something and internalize it in your mind or in your brain, and that's how you have knowledge. You take things and internalize it. So this whole other topic, but then the nomenology is trying to invert that and ask the question, is there, so this is Len was asking the collective question, is there a institutional organization, not just something individual, that is not only opposed to the state, but is an institutional structure that is directly organized against the state, like collective, institutional. And he says, yes, you know, and that's what the nomadic war machine is. But I think it's great because I don't see many political philosophers asking that question. It's always like, what's the best organization of the state? Is it democratic? Or bad to be totalitarian or fascist, but then if it's democratic, how do you organize it? Very few people ask the deeper question, I think, is there organization that is directly opposed to the state but is still collective? And he says, yes, there is. So that's a side answer to your question. But related, there's the space of the king, but then how do you get rid of that? So then the question is from writing, so I don't want to be too provocative on writing, but this really came out of reading your actuarial analysis, and this kind of ambiguity that lies at the heart of it. It was used in the slave trade, and now you want to use it to criticize racism. I think it's totally legitimate, but then I've been teaching the philosophy of technology, and I've gotten interested in there are all these technologies that were invented by the state. They're technologies of the state, and they all seem to be in line with the state, and they're the technologies we've all been forced to learn. Geometry is initially a way of, in Egypt, dividing up the plots of the land after the Nile floods every year. They had to go and reapportion the lands. That's where the term geometrics come. They actually used ropes to lay this stuff out. Now it's become a discipline of its own. We don't really think about its roots. Same thing with statistics. It was really a science of the state to understand, get knowledge of the population. Now it's become a discipline of its own. All these things have wandered far away from their origin in the state. And above all, writing was something invented by the state in order to make legible its mechanisms of capture. And that too has wandered away from the state, and we all learn these things now. We know statistics, we know we have to learn writing above all. Like for 15 years, we're forced to do this thing. It's just kind of amazing. And really the point is there's the same ambiguity, I think, with actuarial analyses and these technologies of the state. So the question is, what came before? Is philosophy tied with writing? I think absolutely it is. That's what we do. And your question is what preceded that? And indeed, there's something in shamanism where their direct relation can't be to texts, and that's really what we do. We study texts. That's what the religions of the book are about. Once writing is invented, religion changed because it changes with technologies. Religion became religions of the book. And what you did if you were religious, you read these sacred texts and you studied them and you pondered them. But that happens only when writing comes into being, because obviously there are no texts until writing comes into being. And prior to that, then there's, it's less related to writing than usually to the voice. So it is said, because it's an oral tradition, rather than it is written. And then obviously related much more to nature than to text. So I do think there's a big shift there. So, yeah.
So there's a connection, you said very nicely, the way in which we have to incorporate all these technologies into our own lives. We have to learn to read, we have to learn to use statistics. But we're also being observed in many, many ways, right? Not only do we have to learn how to count, but we are counted. So I wanted to connect something you said there with the actuarial account of slavery, that there's a big debate in what's called the new history of capitalism. New history of capitalism says that slavery was in fact the leading edge of capitalism and not an anachronistic whole. So it's a debate in Marxist circles for a while around that. So in the popularization of the new history of capitalism, you get the 1619 project, and one of their small points in there is that plantation accounting is one of the first first laboratories for individual productivity analysis. Because in the past, in a factory, you might look at how productive a shift was, right? But they didn't analyze the individual worker. But plantations did advance that. So there's an advancement in accounting on American plantations. In particular, at least that was the one they were studying. Possibly did the same in Brazil and other places, but they were studying southern plantations. So that's another example of the way in which now we are all measured individually on our productivity. How many books did you do? How many articles? And that's for privileged professors, right? I mean, you get some folks who are counting their keystrokes, or they're counting the number of calls they can get, or how long you can keep somebody on. When you call them, right, how long can you keep the person on the line? When they call you, how quickly can you get off the line? Right? So the measure, not only do we have to learn how to measure, but we are measuring in hundreds of ways. So I just wanted to connect that actuarial bit about slave ships. Also, the enslaved labor and people who are on the plantations, they individually measure their productivity.
Yeah, that's fascinating how the slave trade and plantations were actually kind of cutting edge of these kind of techniques. So, yeah. Thanks.
He's first.
Yeah, sorry, Jason.
You had quoted the technology is neither good or bad or never neutral. So in the technological advances in audio and visual technologies, phones, FaceTime, Zoom, but even audiobooks, it would be foolish for me to say it would be foolish for me to say that we won't have audio articles and things like that. Where does these advancements in technologies from the audio and visual standpoint, even podcasts, where do you see it fitting going forward? Is it an apparatus of the state, or is it a rebellion against the state if we're going away from writing with these technological advances? Where do you see it fitting?
Well, I'll cite Melvin Kranzberg again because certainly can't predict. Technologies are neither good nor bad, but they're not neutral. I mean, you can just look at, so I don't know how to predict this, but you just look at what happened with social media. People initially thought it'd be this great thing, and people can democratize and communicate outside of a state apparatus. And then it turned out, no, people went down, got into epistemic bubbles and echo chambers, and it wound up, far from being a democratizing thing, has wind up helping to undermine democracy in lots of ways. And that's hard to predict what's going to happen with these sorts of things. I remember when smartphones came out, reading articles that people thought we were going to enter a new age of orality, kind of a second orality, because we'll all be talking to each other on our phones. Turned out, no, we spend most of our time texting, and it's still written rather than oral for reasons that are not entirely clear. I think just you don't interrupt people, when you call, you have to answer immediately, and texting was a way not to do that. But I don't know, it's going to change things in lots of ways, and everyone's talking about AI. I think that's going to change things in lots of ways. I think in the short term, maybe it's overhyped. I think in the medium and long term, it is going to do radical changes. But I don't know. I talked to a student about maybe a year ago who has never read a printed book from cover to cover. It's not that he doesn't read, but he reads on his Kindle and reads short things. And so, but I don't want to complain about this generation because I'm an old fuddy-duddy. I still like books, but it's a whole new thing. People complain we were listening to the Beatles and Rolling Stone, and it was terrible music and unethical. And I feel like this is just a new regime now of how people read. Audiovisual has changed, and how they read and see things. They're besieged by images in a way I never was. So. It's a huge change, and I would turn to you, like younger people than me, who probably have a better sense of where it's going to go. So, yeah.
Hi, Dan. So thank you for your talk. It's really good to hear you talk about this. I have a kind of an assemblage of a question. There's a lot of parts that I'm not completely clear on, so I selfishly hope you'll help me make sense of my own question to you. But is your talk about the ambiguity of all of these technologies and how they, in a sense, almost kind of originate from the archaic state as forms of capture to consolidate onto the state itself, and you end with writing, but I'm wondering if perhaps we can go even further, right? Because what is the precursor to writing? What is necessary for writing to happen? It's language, right? You need to have a way to communicate in order for writing to be intelligible, for writing to make sense of things. So in that sense, is writing the deepest we can go in terms of these ambiguous technologies of the state, or is perhaps language itself, the method of communication itself, also one of these ambiguous technologies of the state? And regardless of whether you think yes or no to that question, is this kind of what you think Deleuze is getting at when he talks about how, when he looks at the history of philosophy, he's looking for lines of flight outside of philosophy, in that he's recognizing that all the ways in which philosophers create concepts or try to do philosophy are kind of built into this sort of almost insidious capture or trap that the state has laid thousands of years ago. And so in doing his own project, he's searching for a way to be a philosopher without having his own ideas captured by the state.
Yes, to the latter, I would say. I mean, what interests me in these technologies as a state was the realization, just reading Leonard, to get this going, like how much we've internalized them and how much the state has imposed them upon us, like writing and math and geometry, and it's become part of who we are, because it's a classical schema in technology that we externalized ourselves and our technologies. You know, like a bottle is an externalization of a woman's breast, or a hammer is an externalization of the forearm and fist, and then they get objectified, but then they react back upon us. So every technology you've mastered has changed your body. If you grew up, you know, using knife, fork, and spoon, and then figure out how to use chopsticks, in order to use chopsticks, your body has to change somewhat. So, and it changes in a big way with all these other technologies. So yes, on that score. Language is interesting because there are forms of writing that long preceded Leroy-Granis' general notion of graphism or inscription. So there are lots of ways of inscribing. It's just inscribing an implement on a surface. That's really what inscription is, or graphism. You have cave paintings, you have lots of things that are notched and so forth. What really changed is when inscription took hold of speech. And Deleuze says this in Anti-Oedipus, that's what the state does, is when inscription gets modeled on the voice and captures the voice. Because that's really all words are. Words are just pictures of sounds. So you could draw a picture of a tree if you want to convey a tree, or you can develop a technology and a technique for drawing a picture of the word tree as it comes out of my mouth. And that's what the word tree is, just E. That's what the alphabet is. It divides up the sound coming out of your mouth, gives you a way to inscribe that on a piece of paper. So every word you see is just a picture. It's an image of sounds. And the great thing about phonetic writing, it takes sounds from any language because you use the alphabet and you just render it as a picture. And that's the big transition. That's when language, when speech gets technologized. You get a technique to take language, take it off the body. It's no longer speech. It's no longer the powerful speech of the shaman or the rhetorician. You take it off the body and you stick it out here on a page. And that's the real transition that changes everything, really, I think. So that's why I do think writing is important, because then language becomes something separated both from the world and from speakers, and becomes this thing that you can then analyze and relate to on its own. And then you get all these problems of truth and belief, logic. You can start doing proofs that you couldn't do without writing, because you can't keep all that stuff in memory. It's an externalized memory, so you don't have to keep things in the head, and you can consult things here. So, I mean, there's a lot of literature on this, how writing was a kind of singularity in the history of technology, and I would agree. But not the only thing, by any means.
Great, all right.
All right, thank you.
We've got one more